In advance of our lecture on trade unions, I want to outline some general characteristics of the British trade union movement and point out some general trends which have affected trade unions in Britain in the post-war period. The first general point which we need to be aware of is that British trade unions have often been described as having a labourist ethos, and we need to have a sense of what this means. First of all, it means that generally British trade unions have been models of constitutional propriety. They have generally exhibited a deep ambivalence towards political involvement and have generally regarded the use of industrial power for political ends as illegitimate. This has originated out of a fear of legal restraint, concern for the unity of the movement, but also as a consequence of the existence of the Labour Party, which has in turn emphasised a demarcation between the industrial and political spheres. In addition, British trade unions are labourist insofar as it follows on from these characteristics that they have generally confined themselves to demands focused upon members' economic interests. Typically, better wages and improved conditions of work have been their major objectives. As we already intimated, a consequence of this ethos has been that both trade unions and the Labour Party have generally sought to ensure that there's a clear demarcation of industrial and political spheres. And as we'll see in the lecture, throughout much of the post-war period, this meant that free collective bargaining and voluntarist legal framework for industrial relations were regarded as particularly important features of the industrial relations landscape. A further characteristic of the British trade union movement is its complex and fragmented organisation. Historically, we've been able to identify several different types of trade unions. Craft unions, which represent skilled workers. Here an example would be trade unions representing engineers or electricians. In addition to those, there are general unions, for example, a union like the Transport and General Workers Union. Also, unions which represented the majority of people in a particular union, for example, the National Union of Mine Workers, which represented most workers in the mining industry. In addition to that, and a phenomenon that's been particularly evident in the post-war period, is the growth of white-collar and professional unions. Here we might think of unions representing the teaching profession. In part as a consequence of this, what we have tended to observe in British industrial relations is that bargaining and decision-making structures have tended to be decentralised and diffused. When we think about this character of trade unions in Britain, this complex and fragmented organisation, we can imagine that many different unions may be representing the interests of different workers within the same workforce. So it's been important that there's been that level of decentralisation. But on the other hand, a consequence of this has meant that the leadership of unions have often found it difficult to control their members, and this has manifested itself, for example, in the post-war period with a tendency towards unofficial strikes. Another point that we need to recognise as emerging from this fragmented organisation is that different unions often had different interests. For example, for much of the post-war period, unions representing the most low-paid workers generally favoured incomes policies. Those representing higher-paid workers tended to favour free collective bargaining. There is, of course, an organisation which attempts to bring together the interests of different trade unions, the Trade Union Congress, which is a peak organisation. It is a federation of a variety of different trade unions. While it doesn't include all trade unions, the vast majority of trade unionists are members of unions which are affiliated to the TUC. It certainly represents the largest unions. And it seeks to draw up common policies and campaign on behalf of its members. However, as again we'll see in the lecture, the TUC has little power over its affiliates, and this was something that was to have a number of consequences for trade unions and for the British state during the post-war period. It's also important that we get a sense of some of the key trends in the post-war union movement. The post-war consensus was one in which the British trade union movement saw a growing membership. In 1945 there was 7.9 million members of trade unions. By 1955 this had increased to 9.7 million. By 1979 13.2 million members of trade unions in Britain. This was to prove to be the peak, the year of Margaret Thatcher's election for trade union membership. And as we can see from this graph, thereafter trade union membership has fallen significantly. By 1997 the trade unions had fewer members than at any time since 1945. The gains in terms of membership of the entire post-war period have been wiped out within 17 years. Since then, membership has fluctuated a little but has stabilised overall, such that in 2007 there were 7.6 million members of trade unions. Another key trend has been a declining number of trade unions. In 1945 there were 781 trade unions in Britain. By 1979 this stood at 475, and this decline has continued and become particularly more marked in recent years as many smaller unions have been taken over by larger unions and mergers have occurred amongst the larger unions. For example, in 2001, the Amalgamated Engineering and Electrical Union and the Manufacturing, Science and Finance Union merged together to form Amicus. In 2006, the Association of University Teachers and NAPFE, the National Association of Teachers in Further and Higher Education, joined together to form the University and College Lecturers Union. And in 2007, Amicus, which had been formed itself only in 2001, came together with the Transport and General Workers Union to form Unite. Finally, it's worth getting a sense of the characteristics of present trade union members. It's important that we have a sense of the difficulties which trade unions face in organising. Currently, we find that more women are unionised than men. A general observation which probably holds for much of the post-war period is that trade unions are stronger in public sector workplaces than they are in private sector workplaces. In addition, trade unions have generally found it more difficult to organise part-time workers, and as we can see from the table here, part-timers are still underrepresented in the union movement as compared in the workforce as a whole. And generally, trade unions also tend to be easier to organise in larger workplaces. As you can see, the majority of trade unionists work in workplaces of 50 or more employees. So that concludes all I want to say in this online lecture. If there are any questions that you might have had about any of this material, please bring them to the lecture on Monday. Thanks for listening and thanks for watching.